When we picture great empires falling, we usually think of conquering armies, epic battles, and cities in flames. But what if the real story is, well, a lot quieter than that? What if it's actually a financial story? A pattern of self-destruction that has repeated itself almost identically throughout history. Okay, let's get into it. So how did these massive, world-spanning powers actually come to an end? The popular idea is that some dramatic external force takes them down. But history tells a very different story, one that starts from the inside out. Yeah, it's almost never a simple story of invasion. Sure, external pressures are always there, but the fatal weakness? That's rarely an enemy at the gates. The pattern is one of self-destruction. Believe it or not, 4 of the world's greatest powers have followed an almost identical financial path straight to ruin. It's a path that starts with grand ambition and ends with the slow, quiet decay of their own money. And as we're about to see, it's a pattern that feels eerily familiar today. To really wrap our heads around this cycle, we first have to talk about the nature of money itself. The whole story really boils down to 3 key ideas: trust, standards, and this really important process called debasement. So what in the world is debasement? Well, it's basically when a government secretly makes its money worth less. Back in ancient times, this was literal. They'd take a pure silver coin and mix in cheaper metals like copper, but still pretend it was pure silver. Today, it's creating more currency out of thin air, what we just call printing money. The result, though, is exactly the same. And this table just lays it out perfectly. On the left, you've got sound money. It's tied to a real, tangible asset. Its value is stable, and people trust it. But on the right, you've got debased money. It's backed only by a government's promise. And as the government makes more and more of it, that trust starts to fade. Its value gets shaky, and you end up with rising prices, what we all know as inflation. The key takeaway here is this: once that trust is broken, the whole system starts to wobble. Okay, so now let's look at the proof. This isn't just some abstract theory. It's a story that has played out over and over again. We're going to trace this exact path through 3 of the most powerful empires in the history of the world. Let's start with Rome. For hundreds of years, the engine of the massive Roman economy was this one small silver coin, the denarius. It was introduced way back in 211 BC. And it was trusted across 3 continents for one simple reason: it was almost pure silver. Now check this out. This chart shows exactly what happened. As Rome's expenses for its military and bureaucracy ballooned, the emperors started debasing the currency to pay the bills. By 211 AD, a denarius was only 50% silver. And by 265 AD, it had crashed to just 5%. It was basically a worthless coin with a thin silver coating. The consequences of this were, well, catastrophic. You had runaway inflation that just wrecked the economy. Soldiers started refusing to fight because their pay was worthless. So when the Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 AD, it wasn't just because of barbarians at the gate. It was because the state literally couldn't afford to exist anymore. The government had killed its own money. Okay, fast forward about 12 centuries later, and guess what? The pattern repeats. The Spanish Empire becomes the richest on Earth after discovering a literal mountain of silver in Potosi, Bolivia. All this silver fueled the creation of the Spanish dollar, which became the world's first truly global currency. But here's the crazy part. Even with a nearly endless supply of silver, Spain spent even more on constant wars. King Philip II inherited a mountain of debt and then borrowed even more. As you can see here, he defaulted on the country's debts 4 times in 40 years. Can you imagine? Each time, he completely destroyed the trust of the people who had loaned him money. Spain's story is such a powerful lesson. It shows that even having all the resources in the world doesn't matter if your spending is out of control. They simply borrowed and spent their way into decline. The pattern held true once again. Next up, Britain, where this same pattern unfolds yet again. At its peak, the British Empire was the largest in history. Its currency, the pound sterling, was the world's reserve currency, and everyone trusted it because it was backed by a gold standard. You could literally walk into a bank and exchange your paper pounds for a fixed amount of real gold. But then came 2 world wars, and to pay for them, Britain had to leave the gold standard and just print money. This slide shows you the result. By the end of World War II, Britain was completely bankrupt. Its national debt had soared to an unbelievable 270% of its entire economic output. With the pound basically broken, Britain couldn't afford its global empire anymore. At the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the US dollar officially took over as the world's reserve currency. And the empire on which the sun never set, well, it just disintegrated. So we've seen this play out in Rome, in Spain, and in Britain. The sequence of events is identical every single time. So now let's just lay out the 7 stages of this historical pattern step by step. Okay, it always starts with stage 1. A great power is dominant, and its power is built on a foundation of sound money. Then comes stage 2. The empire stretches itself too thin, either militarily or economically. This leads right into stage 3, where the country starts spending way more than it brings in, creating these huge, permanent deficits. To cover those deficits, the government turns to stage 4, debasing the currency. And that action inevitably kicks off stage 5, runaway inflation, because you have more money chasing the same amount of stuff. Pretty soon, people figure out what's going on, which starts stage 6, a widespread loss of confidence in the money itself. And that's the beginning of the end, leading to stage 7, the system can't hold itself up anymore, and you get economic and political collapse. Which brings us to today. The reason this pattern is so important to understand is because when you apply this exact same framework to the United States and the US dollar right now, the parallels are, well, they're pretty hard to miss. Let's just look at the data neutrally. Here we see stage 3 in action, deficit spending. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was under $1 trillion. By 2025, it's projected to be over $36 trillion. This kind of exponential growth practically forces the government into stage 4, which is currency debasement, creating trillions of new dollars just to pay the interest on the debt. And this slide shows us the beginning of stage 6, loss of confidence. Back in the year 2000, 70% of all the money held in reserve by central banks around the world was in US dollars. Today, that number has dropped to 58%, and it keeps trending down as other countries actively look for alternatives. So, if the pattern holds true, what could happen next? History doesn't give us a crystal ball, but it does show us 3 potential outcomes for a global power that's navigating these final stages. The first possibility is a controlled decline, kind of like what Britain went through, a painful adjustment to becoming a second-tier power. The second is a chaotic collapse, like Rome, where the whole system just breaks down. And the third is a rapid system reset, where a new global currency and a new world order are set up relatively quickly. The really critical thing to remember, though, is that unlike Rome or Britain, a crisis for the US dollar would be a crisis for the entire deeply interconnected global economy. At the end of the day, economic laws are kind of like physical laws. They aren't just suggestions. A country can't spend money it doesn't have forever, and it can't devalue its currency without facing consequences. Rome, Spain, and Britain all proved this. History has shown us this exact same sequence 4 times now. The only variable is the timeline. The pattern itself doesn't lie. So the only real question is, what comes next?